She's working on landed and landless castes, trajectories of transformation in colonial South Malabar. Bhupika, please take over the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiba ma'am. A very good evening and a warm welcome to everyone to the 13th session of the 7-day online national conference organized by the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, in honor of Dr. Paslipil and Dr. M.T. Narayanan on their retirement. The ongoing theme for this webinar is Critique and Constructions, Contemporary Writings on Histories of Kerala. This webinar provides a platform to interact with the new generation of historians and social scientists working on Kerala's past, bringing forward a revised version of the existing assumptions and delving into fresh perspectives and conceptualization. Today, we have with us a distinguished scholar, Dr. Divya Kannan, to share the findings of her study on the topic Situating Childhood in Kerala's Past. Her research interests includes the histories of empires, childhood, youth, gender, etc. Before we move forward with the session, there are a set of general instructions for the participants. All the participants are requested to mute your audio and turn off your video throughout this session. Attendance of the participants will be recorded automatically. If any of the participants accidentally leave or unable to rejoin the session, can continue with us through our live streaming in YouTube. If you have any queries in between the session, please type in them into the chat box or as comment in YouTube, and I will read it out to the speaker on your behalf at the end of the session. Without further delay, I invite Ms. Praveena, our MPhil scholar, to formally introduce the resource person and for the welcome address. Over to you, Praveena.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the 13th section of the lecture series about today's section about situating childhood in Kerala past. We have Dr. Divya Kannan as our guest. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Dr. Divya Kannan. She is an assistant professor of Department of History, School of Humanities and Social Science in Shivanada University, Noida. She holds MPhil and PhD in Modern Indian History from JNU. Her research interest focuses on 19th, 20th century South Asian histories, include history of childhood and youth, gender and sexuality, empires and colonial violence, history of education, curriculum and pedagogy, public and oral histories. She is currently working on a project that explores the history of education, childhood and poverty in 19th-20th century Kerala. She is the co-convener of Critical Childhood and Youth Studies Collective. I welcome you, ma'am, and I welcome all of you to today's session. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shiba, and to the organizers and the students of Kaladi University. It's indeed a pleasure to participate in this conference. And as all of you may have noticed, a lot of the previous speakers were also from JNU, and I feel very humbled to be in their company as well. Today, my topic, while it is broadly titled Situating Childhoods in Kerala's Past, let me give you a brief introduction into what does the history of childhood itself entail. I would, after the introduction, I would like to read out a paper that I have, which at present currently explores the intersections between histories of education and history of childhood in 19th century and early 20th century Kerala. In the last few decades, and students will know this better than me, there has been a lot of revisionist scholarship on the histories written in the Indian subcontinent. In particular, we have the Subaltern School of Historiography, which has in fact provoked generations of scholars to look at questions of subaltern history, to challenge elitist narratives of nationalism, so on and so forth. But one historical figure that has often been missed out in these conversations is that of the child itself. And it is my premise, along with other historians of childhood, that the reason why we do not talk about the child in historical writing is because of the assumption that children lack agency. And the word agency is very, very central to the narration of historical past itself, Because in the process of writing history, we as historians in the future, writing about the past, are very keen to discover the voices of people in the past. But in our query for understanding the voices from the past, we are only looking at adult figures or narratives that have been left behind by adults. Or in other words, most of our histories are about adults who write for adults and then who are read by adults. And in this entire matrix of writing adulthood histories, we often forget the vast number of children or these same adults who were once upon a time children. And the reason I say that, and the reason why I am emphasizing on the word agency, is because in the last few decades, agency itself has been subject to critical scrutiny and attention. You have various scholars, especially those again working in the subaltern school, who have challenged the assumption that only people of certain social status or economic status have agency. Now, what is agency? Agency is your ability to autonomously take decisions, to act, or if you believe in absolute individualism, the belief that you have the capacity to determine your own circumstances. But we also know the truth, and if we follow Marx and his famous phrase that men and women often are shaped by their circumstances. Yeah? You make what you can do with the circumstances given to you. That is, you do not always autonomously act in your present or in your past. You often act in accordance with the circumstances and the context that you're in. And children are no less important in this story. So when I say histories of childhood, please don't confuse it with histories of children, because childhood and children still needs to be analytically and theoretically distinguished. There is a sense that childhood is equivalent to children, and it is my personal premise that that is a very flawed distinction to make if we are to write the histories of childhood. Of course, childhood is about young people. It is about young people who are stratified according to age, and age is a very important category of analysis in our research. So in one way, I am making a case for us to look at age along with other axes of historical analysis. For instance, in your own classes, and your professors know this best, you often talk about gender, you talk about caste, class, race, but you don't talk about age. And it has been the scholarly intervention of revisionist historians in the past few decades that age is also fundamental towards understanding power dynamics, because it is age that stratifies us alongside various axes. So for instance, being a young woman in society as opposed to an older man, or being a mother of two children as opposed to a widow, are all questions of historical and contemporary importance because it determines your social position. The question that we have to ask today is, however, who is the Malayali child? We are all very aware that in Kerala, there is a positive understanding of this child. Everybody is interested in the question of childhood and children in Kerala. And the reason is because the child, both as an object of intervention and a subject of socio-political development, looms large in everyday discourses. So for instance, the Malayali child is not just a Malayali child simply for speaking in Malayalam, but because the child embodies certain imaginaries or certain imaginations. And given Kerala's long history of social protest and radical political organization, there is an assumption that the child embodies a developmentalist present, which is what historians like J. Devika puts forward, as well as the promise of a better future. Or in other words, the Malayali child is embedded with notions of what constitutes the norms and formations of childhood. So on one hand, you have the ideal of childhood, who should be the ideal child. And on the other hand, you have actual reality, the norms that govern different children. But this question is actually rather easy to answer because there is nothing called a single Malayali child, just the way there is nothing called a single Indian child. Because once you start unpacking the category of the child, you will realize it is no longer a neutral category. It is not a category that only talks about pure innocence or pure joy of childhood, but the child is formed or shaped according to social dynamics. So you have a Malayali Dalit child, you will have a Malayali upper caste child, a Muslim Malayali child. Right? All of these social hierarchies impinges itself onto the body and minds of children. So in my work, I'm interested in looking at these intersections. I'm interested in understanding what are the discourses of childhood in everyday society in South India, particularly Kerala. I'm also interested in looking at how do we retrieve children's voices from the past. It doesn't mean that we have to go around stage. People do not remain children per se, at least physiologically, you don't remain a child. So because childhood is such a temporary phase, then it becomes very important for us to study childhood, because what are the positions that they occupy as adults later. And the paper that I'm going to discuss with you today, I am looking at two kinds of histories, or maybe three actually. So one is the history of schooling in Kerala, which we are all pretty well aware of. But I am trying to rethink that history of schooling by linking it to questions of childhood itself. And I do that with the rich archives of the Protestant Christian missionaries, of the London Missionary Society and the Church Missionary Society, the LMS and the CMS. And in Kerala's historiography, we have had a very positive view of Christian missionaries, and I would say rightfully so. They have played a very, very crucial part in democratizing mass education. They were the earliest to include children of formerly untouchable caste groups into their schools. But I'm trying to unravel that premise to say, yes, even as missionaries were including children in their schools, what exactly happened in their encounter with children of the colony? Because if you take the missionary as a monolith and children as a monolith, it's a very narrow kind of history that you will write. I'm trying to unpack both the category of the missionary as a complex imperial figure and the category of the colonized child, of the native child in Kerala, who is then adapting and accommodating to the context defined by the missionaries. So I'm going to read some parts of the paper and then I shall be explaining in between. Okay. So the paper is tentatively titled Caste, Space and Schooling in 19th Century Travancore. And you will soon see why I'm interested in also talking about spatiality as well. Throughout the 1840s and early 1850s, tensions arose between the British resident in the princely state of Travancore in colonial South India and upper caste Hindu administrative elites on the question of agrestic slavery. Pulayars, Parayars, Cherumas and Kurumbars, condemned as untouchable outcasts, were tied down as slaves on government or sarkar and private agricultural fields and households belonging to upper caste Brahmins, Nayars and Syrian Christians. Owing to mounting political pressures from the British officialdom, as well as the Protestant missionaries of the LMS and the CMS, the apathetic Travancore administration reluctantly undertook steps to address the matter. You may know that throughout the 1850s, the missionaries were constantly petitioning the British government to end domestic slavery in princely Travancore and Cochin. In September 1853, a royal proclamation declared that the future children born of Sarkar slaves would be set free from the date thereof. Manumitted slaves could possess property, and slave parents and children will not be separated. Yet orthodox caste hegemony prevailed as the proclamation was largely inoperative in result. It was basically a failed declaration, nothing changed on the ground for slave populations. It maintained that all social distinctions and prohibitions on intercommensality, marriage, as well as rules of distance population between castes were to be observed unchanged. A few years later, the Travancore administration would embark on an ambitious reform program, including the expansion of mass vernacular education in a bid to become a modern princely state. We know this from the work of Robin Jeffrey, from Koji Kawashima, who constantly say that Travancore was one of the earliest states to become modern. I am actually questioning this modernity by saying, for whom was this modern? Was this modern for all castes? And within all castes, was it actually a modern state for all children? Amid such tensions, the future of these soon-free children of the slaves, and the issue of education for all became a major bone of contention. Against this background, I examined two distinct sides of schooling. So my paper deals with two kinds of schools. One is the slave school. The missionaries used to call the schools that they set up for Pulayas and Parayas as slave schools because they were unfortunately treated as slaves in the 19th century. And the other school that I look at is the boarding school. Missionaries were very active in bringing children in segregated spaces and trying to educate them separately from the rest of society. I problematized the category of poor childhoods in the 19th century by attending to the interlinkages between schooling, childhood, and spatiality. Sharada Balagopalan, who is a very well-known post-colonial scholar, argues that a multiplicity of marginal child figures was produced across various sites of schooling in the colony, premised on a colonial extractive logic visible through the relationship between state and capital. Sharada Balagopalan's major argument is that various kinds of child figures were produced. They were produced in the orphanages, in the reformatories, in schools. That is, the colonial state was also trying to frame this notion of the child. You have to remember that in the history of colonialism, people, both adults and children, were also treated as children. You may have heard, if you read imperial histories, you will see British people are constantly calling Indians as children. They are saying Indians are immature, they are irrational, they are too emotional, and they're incapable of looking after themselves. So there is already a value judgment assigned to being a child. So being childish, this is a sentence that everybody must have used in your life. You often call each other childish. You tell your friends, don't be childish. And the whole assumption when you tell somebody don't be childish is that you are not mature enough. But the history of imperialism itself shows that all colonized people were actually treated as a child. So Balagopalan's theory is that on one hand, there is the production of the child figure. And on the other hand, along with Satadru Sen, she says, there is also an infantilization of the Indian adult as well. Already prevalent, but rendered invisible in the social imaginary of Travancore, various untouchable caste children were plotted onto the margins of caste-determined spatial geographies of schooling. These child figures, identifiable by their involvement in hard labor, existed outside of a traditional conceptualization of childhood, wherein upper caste children's innocence and so-called natural right to authority by virtue of birth was valued supreme. So this is an argument I borrow from Sanal Mohan, where he says, when you ask the question, who is the Malayali child or whose childhood is important, you will soon find out that caste plays a major role. Because what is childhood? If I ask all of you in this group today, what is childhood? You are very likely to say childhood is a happy phase in life. It is when you feel carefree. Children should have the right to play, should have the right they should have parents to take care of them. The state should protect them. So childhood is seen as a stage of innocence and protection. But this is a very 19th century view. And when you break it down by caste and class, you will soon realize only some children are entitled to love, protection, and innocence. This is why in a country like India, you can have children on the street who are begging, but the children in your own homes, you will say must be loved and protected, but the poor child on the streets will be unloved and unprotected. That itself is an indication to you that there is no universal notion of childhood. And this is what is going to happen in the colonial times as well. Caste is going to be the major shaping factor of what constitutes childhood norms. On the one hand, upper caste children were trained in an indigenous system of schooling to occupy influential positions. And on the other hand, irrespective of their biological age or immaturity, untouchable caste children, especially Dalit children, were reduced to varying animal-like conditions, largely capable of manual labor with little or no mental and intellectual ability to advance themselves. So the assumption in the caste system is that upper caste children have to be protected. Upper caste children are so innocent, they should be kept away from any kinds of danger. But the lower caste child is often treated as, hard labor, as an animal. That yes, the lower caste child is criminalized, the lower caste child is condemned. And this tension is going to seep into the question of schooling itself. The historical relationship between marginalized children and schooling have long been subject to academic scrutiny across socio-cultural contexts. In India, both the 19th century British colonial state and British missionaries sought to confine untouchable caste children in segregated and institutionalized sites at the juvenile periphery of the empire, such as orphanages, industrial schools, reformatories, and boarding schools. To this list of schools, I am adding slave schools, that is, schools attended by Pulayar Christians in the 19th century, and show that they compel us to rethink the inherent instabilities of the so-called project of colonial modernity and childhood formation. The contestations over schooling untouchable caste children in Travancore, including the Dalits, speak to a wider narrative of spatiality, poverty, and childhood. And this is very similar to the histories of Black slave children in America, indigenous children, Native American children in Canada, and colonized children in Africa as well. This is a very similar history to them. Across these contexts, colonial administrators and missionaries, often at loggerheads, but largely in agreement on the goals of education for the poor, devised interventionist strategies aimed at resocialization and re-education of various categories of children. So some children were considered lazy, good for nothing, backward, and all of that. And the attempt of the state and the missionaries is to re-socialize them, is to train them to become better children so that they can fulfill the roles expected of them. And this is what is happening in Kerala as well. But what are the challenges of writing such a history? And that's something that's very important to me because the methodology part also has to be explained. I locate this research within the frame of connected histories, and I argue that investigating the past can enhance the dialogue between geographers who study space and young people and historians working on and with young people. The disembodied experience of archival research, however, raises certain questions for the historian of childhood. So on one hand, the historian wants to recover children's lost voices, but on the other hand, the historian is very worried that if I write about children, then there will be nothing about children, it will only be about adults. How does the historian now deal with this dilemma? And this is a dilemma that I face when I write about Travancore as well. Since their arrival in Travancore in the early decades of the 19th century, the LMS and CMS struggled to grasp the insidious workings of the caste system. The extent of heathenism, they called everybody heathens, British evangelicals argued, could be assessed by the prevalent practices such as idolatry, ritualistic sacrifices, caste rules, child marriage, among others, and the consequent inferior condition of children in the colony. So what am I trying to say here? That the missionaries, when they came to India, the first, apart from attacking the religious beliefs of the people, they were also doing something else at a cultural plane. They were also saying that Indian parents are not good parents. Indian parents do not know how to take care of their children. And in Travancore, they are constantly saying that lower caste people are absolutely incapable of taking care of their children. So once they have that discourse going, what happens? Then they can justify their intervention. So they can participate in child removal campaigns, they can participate in child adoption campaigns, they can take away these children from poor people and say that we will now demonstrate to you how to be civilized and modern parents. And this is not just a matter of 19th century, even today in international debates, we see that if you're following debates in Sweden and Norway, very often the children of immigrant parents are forcefully taken away because Scandinavian countries will constantly say that, third world countries, parents don't know how to take care of their children. So this is actually a history of that kind of practice. For instance, before traveling to Alappuzha in 1817, the CMS missionary Thomas Norton made a dramatic appeal to his supporters back in England. So he was making a very, very sentimental speech to people in Britain asking for funds because after all, missionaries wanted money to do their activities. And in his appeal, this is what he says about the lower caste of Alappuzha. He says, and I quote, "The mothers cannot support them, their fathers they know not. The boys who survive infancy are abandoned at an early age, they grow up in moral sin, and they become corrupters of the succeeding generation. The girls are reserved for the basest purposes. The wretched, corrupted, brutalized mothers anxiously look forward to the period when they shall make gain by the degradation of their daughters." End quote. Thomas Horton believed that Indian mothers, particularly lower castes and classes in Travancore, were responsible for their children's degradation. But what did he do? He circumvented the structural violence perpetrated by caste customs, and instead he placed the complete blame of poor children onto poor mothers. So basically he said bad mothers equal to bad children. And what did he imply? Implying that poor mothers raised bastard children. So he's literally calling them bastard children. He's saying the children don't even know who the fathers are and subjected daughters to prostitution. He characterized Malayali lower caste mothers as being incapable of adequate nurture, moral guidance, and protection. And these ideas are very, very popular in England at this time, that a happy child means a happy parent. With such repetitive condemnations, poor Malayali parents were seen as doing more harm than good in missionary writings. And hence he justified the necessity of a civilizing Christian mission. However, in Travancore, the physical removal of poor children into the schools was not very easy. So on one hand, Norton is saying this, but in praxis, he really cannot take the children away because parents are also reacting. They are also competing for authority and they are resisting the missionary approaches of taking away their children. During instances of upper caste children declaring their desire to convert in the schools, the missions faced a lot of backlash, including judicial and police action. Sometimes there were assaults on native preachers, and in many cases, children were withdrawn from the school in an act of protest. But when it came to the poor laboring castes, there was little encouragement to educate their children, particularly boys, by removing them from work. Wary of caste sanctions and the violent retribution from landed elites in choosing to convert, as well as a lingering suspicion of missionary teaching, many poor families refuse to give up their children for long periods of schooling. So remember, when the missionaries are coming to Travancore, it is not that the poor are rushing to them. The missionaries are trying to convince them that we are offering you a better life, we are offering you a better religious tradition. But poor parents are also negotiating it. So there is some kind of agency with which they are adapting to the circumstances. And because they are poor people and many of them are bonded laborers, they don't want their children to spend a lot of time in the school because they have, mouths to feed back home. At the same time, there were many rumors in Travancore and Cochin about the missionaries being kidnappers in disguise, waiting to capture children and to sell them into slavery abroad. So you can imagine the missionary, so this existing historical narrative that we have in Kerala, that everybody embraced the missionary, is actually not true. There is a lot of suspicion even amongst the poor, but because the oppression was so immense, the poor are also utilizing the opportunities offered by Christian missionaries. Throughout the 19th century and beyond, LMS and CMS missionaries witnessed scenes of brutal exploitation of untouchable caste children as well as their families. In one report, they said they were put to work from a very young age with little or no remuneration in kind. A missionary in Anjango in Travancore reported, "I saw a young boy and a girl being sold for 7 rupees. In another case, a total of 15 rupees were paid for 6 slaves, 1 man, 2 women, and 3 children." In 1841, John Abbs of the LMS recorded that rich landlords were at the liberty to separate enslaved children from their parents, husband from wife. His sensibilities were most upset by the lack of stable family households among the slaves, which according to him only worsened their moral and spiritual conditions. In this agrarian caste complex, there were no children in the sense that the British missionaries had desire to render visible. So my argument is that the British are coming to India with a particular notion of childhood. And that is why it's important to write a transnational history. You have to remember that missionaries are not coming like blank slates. They have a lot of ideas from Victorian England. And when they come to India, they're looking for children that will fit into the notion of English children. So they're looking for children who have the freedom to play, who have parents, who are not bonded laborers. But they come to India and they realize there are so many kinds of children according to caste. Just the way in England, there are so many children according to class. And they realize that this innocent child that they're talking about, this innocence that was ascribed to the child, is actually not there for the lower caste child. Because the lower caste child's innocence is I would say, it's a paradox. The child might be innocent by age, but in reality, the child is actually a bonded laborer. The child is being put through the worst brutal exploitation. And this is a contradiction that the missionaries are unable to resolve. What they find in Travancore are slaves and masters, half or full work hands, subject to the whims and fancies of arrogant landlords. So I'm going to quote a conversation between a CMS missionary and adult Pulaya slaves in North Travancore. This missionary will ask the Pulayas, "Are slaves children bought for sale?" The answer that is given to him, "About 6 months ago, 2 were bought and sold. Afterwards, relatives came to take away them. My master did not want to suffer." How are children paid? Children do not have proper food. They are weak and unable to do hard work. They are not paid any wages until the age of 15. Then the missionary asked them, "Can any slave send his child to school until the age of 15? The answer, "Masters will not allow." Lately, 4 children were driven and beaten away from the school by a Nair landlord who got to hear of them attending. By the 1860s, thousands of government and privately owned slaves in the region had gained their legal freedom. So according to the 1853 and 55 proclamation, they were legally free, but they continued to work on the former masters' lands with little improvement in their general living conditions. In what can be best described as a strategy of compromise, so I call this a strategy of compromise, missionaries couch their provision of schooling to the untouchable caste in a language suitable to appease the upper caste, indicative of the slippages between casteist and racist notions of social stratification. The missionaries claimed that literacy and discipline imparted in the mission school was fundamentally aimed at the erasure of natural defects such as cunningness, dishonesty, etc. So let me explain this. So I can see many colleagues here, for instance, Dr. Abhilash Malel is here who work on agriculture. What they are trying to argue is they are trying to tell the upper caste, allow us to educate your slaves. Allow us to set up schools on your land, especially Syrian Christian masters are saying, allow us to set up these schools because we will discipline them, we will make them docile subjects, they will become better workers. And this is a very interesting commingling of Protestant work ethic in a very feudal hierarchy. So please remember that the missionaries are not radicals here. They are not trying to overturn caste completely. It is the unintended consequence that many lower castes join them. But because they want to continue working in Kerala and they want to win converts, they are constantly compromising with the upper caste. After all, the upper caste and the Syrian Christians have a lot of land, they have a lot of capital. So the compromise that they are going to make is they're going to appeal to the landlords to say, allow us to educate your laborers, we will improve their ways of working, we will improve your productivity. But of course, upper caste and Syrian Christians are not impressed by this. They're extremely careful about allowing the slaves to go to school. Propounding individual freedom and dignity of work, school-centric literacy practices, and school-induced piety was upheld as assets. So education was now seen as an asset, as an advantage to improve social cohesion, thereby marking missionaries as being in favor of a society based on different ranks without the burden of caste pollution. So on one hand, the missionaries were saying, remove caste pollution, don't stigmatize manual labor. But on the other hand, they are not really telling the Pulayar caste that you should aspire to become the Syrian Christian. They are saying you should become better Christians and better human beings, but without the stigma, but do not challenge the landed caste hierarchy as such. But landed elites tended to view missionary offers very differently. They saw the missionaries as unnecessarily interfering in local matters. And every time there was a potential for agrarian discontent because of missionary preaching, they reacted with violence. And we know this from the work of Sanal Mohan and others, that the upper caste did not remain silent. Whenever missionaries started teaching Bible or having scriptural classes for Dalit caste converts, they would react with extreme violence to the point that some of them are also beaten and killed. Most importantly, the thought or the imagination of having children of their former slaves sitting in the same classroom as their own children was something that threatened their claims to traditional authority. At the same time, as Travancore underwent a series of reforms directed at mass vernacular education, this is also the time where Travancore is expanding education under the Diwan, a pervasive grammar of exclusion hounded untouchable caste children. Very often, Dalit children and as well as Irava and Nadar children, they were excluded from the schools on very, very flimsy excuses such as causing hurt to religious sensibilities. So the Diwan would often reject the petition by saying this will cause religious hurt. This will cause, unnecessary problem for social order. And what is surprising and what is not surprising is today also we use the word religious hurt every time there is an effort to, have students from reserve category enter into institutions, right? So elite institutions will often say, let us not disturb law and order. And this is what the Diwan of Travancore is also saying. For Pulaya and Paraya children with no basic property ownership and considered outcast by almost everyone, you have to remember it's not just the upper caste who are mistreating the Pulayas and Parayas. The Idavas and Nadars are also considering them very, very low and untouchable. So there are internal factionalisms also happening. They had no option but to set up schools of their own, but also to attempt to self-teach themselves, or let's say self-taught schools. And that is why this history is very interestingly compared to Black histories. Because even in America, when African American slaves were running away, they were starting their own schools. The disparities between these groups, between the Iravas and Nadas and Pulayas and Parayas, was a crucial factor which influenced Protestant missionary schooling. And we know that Christians from lower caste were often insulted as being rice Christians. And even the upper caste Christians did not want them to participate in the same schools. Samuel Matir, a very, very popular name of the LMS. In Trivandrum, we have the Matir LMS Church. You will recognize by that name. He worked among the Pulayas for almost 40 years, and he was actually called Pulaya Padri. And he writes in one of his books, and he criticized the upper caste by saying, just think of the amazing selfishness of the demand made on part of the wealthier. They have any amount of pecuniary means at command to establish schools for themselves, as exclusive in principle as they please. However, they claim admission to the public schools, and then they not only accept this government charity, but they venture to assert a claim to its exclusive enjoyment. So what is Matir saying? Matir is saying, look at the upper caste. They have all the resources they want to set up schools, but they want the government to set up schools in Travancore, which is what the government does. Government, goes on establishing more and more schools for upper caste. And then when lower caste children want to enter into the schools, the upper caste will say, this is an insult to our religious herd. So he calls it complete selfishness on their part. But my intervention as a historian in this narrative is that Matir is silent about one thing, and that is about how the church itself is treating lower caste. So it's not just that the state is excluding the lower caste, the missionaries are unable to reconcile their universal notions of brotherhood along with the realities of caste. So even when Samuel Matir is pro-lower caste, when he feels sympathetic to the condition of the lower caste, because of his own racist position, he is unable to come to terms with the fact that they must be treated as completely equal in all spheres of life. And this ambiguity is what is marking missionary enterprises, not just in Travancore, but across the world. More scholarship on the social history of Travancore have credited Protestant missionaries as proactive actors. So Michael Taragan, E.T. Matthew, Robin Jeffrey have said that, the missionaries have always been very, very active in educating the poor. Aware of the shared racial and cultural affinities with the imperial administrators, many untouchable groups also approach the missionaries to help them with starting schools. However, I do not agree with this historiography that when E.T. Matthew says that the missionaries were proactive, my critique of that is when you look at the archival sources, very often the missionaries were very reluctant. They were hesitant to do this because they did not want to upset the upper caste. After all, they were targeting the upper caste. They wanted converts from upper caste. So even as they liked the lower caste, they were very careful about how they navigated the situation. So I would not use the word proactive because that means the missionaries came and did everything for the lower caste, which is not true. The lower castes are also taking independent action. They're also forming groups and appealing to the missionaries to start schools for their children. So let me give you an instance. Henry Andrews, Reverend Henry Andrews of the Church Missionary Society in Kottayam. He was very active in Kottayam, Mallappalli, Pallam, all these regions. Henry Andrews experienced an incident when Pulaya adults and children began to come to his school every day and demanded that they should be sent a teacher. Initially, he appreciated them and he said that these people are so pure at heart, they are very sincere and hardworking. And he was very appreciative of all their efforts to educate their children. But he had his doubts. So Andrews, on one hand, he's appreciating the lower caste, but on the other hand, he says, I am doubtful of the authenticity of these converts. Maybe they are trying to take advantage of our opportunities. In 1863, frustrated with his efforts and doubting the intelligence of the people he served, Andrews started to compare the intellect of the Pulaya, the intelligence of a Pulaya person, to that of an animal, utterly devoid of any mental faculties. So on one hand, he wrote to his supporters in England that look at the Pulaya, so simple, so innocent, so sincere. On the other hand, he started writing saying, but they are unintelligent. They are unintellectual creatures. They are like animals. And this relegation of the lower caste or the Dalit as an animal is something that is a product of both the mixing of race and caste. Because Andrews is also affected by Victorian theories and notions of race at this point. He borrows a phrase from Malayalam, a very popular phrase in the 19th century, and he judges the Pulayas in his congregation as people living a life of extremes, swinging between indulgence and misery, incapable of planning or saving for the future. Despite their opposition to the landlord, the violence inflicted by the landlord, he of course opposed the violence. He was very keen to impress the landlords more than the Pulayas. He started asking the landlords if they were impressed by the shift in the behavior of the lower caste from being called liars and thieves to orderly and neat individuals. If you look up any historical literature of the 19th century, you will see that Pulayas were often considered to be liars and thieves by upper caste. Despite this is a big irony because they are working so hard all day, but society is calling them liars. And Andrews is also falling into the same trap. He's unable to come out of this tension. On one hand, he wants his slaves to be freed and he wants the landlords to erect prayer houses for them. But on the other hand, he desperately wants the landlord to be impressed by the efforts of the missionaries. Situated within this discourse of improvement, of improving the native, evangelicals like Andrews claim to be offering the greatest gift of all to the lowest classes. He said, we are offering them respectability and a civilized culture through the demonstration of a visibly transformed behavior brought about by a model of practical Christianity through churches and schools. Missionaries hope to attract the elites into their fold eventually. Across Travancore, slave churches and schools, as the missionaries called these informal congregational spaces, they began to emerge in small and open single-room prayer shed-like structures. So when I tell you the word school, please don't think it is the kind of school we go to today. We are not looking at full buildings with full infrastructure. Any site in which literacy practices were conveyed was called a school. If you look at old photographs of slave schools, you will see that they were very tiny pieces of land, sometimes in the middle of the rice field or top of a hill in Kottayam. Wherever the slaves could come together, that was considered a slave school. Remember, this is the same time when the Travancore government, as well as other missionaries, are establishing proper concrete school buildings. These slave schools were a far cry from the imagination of a physically bounded built school space with concomitant educational materials and routines. Wherever a spot of land was found, away from the landlord, a slave school cum church began to emerge. Though erratically attended, community elders or voluntary schoolmasters appointed by the missions gathered Pulaya children for instruction in rudimentary literacy skills and biblical scriptures, and in the evening, adults attended the same school space for prayer and Bible worship. Now, how do we understand the history of the slave school? So one hand, I told you they are not proper concrete buildings. So do we consider them as a part of the school structure? But on the other hand, the question that we need to ask as social historians is, what is the implication? What are the meanings of a shift that is now taking place? The numbers are small. Very few Pulayas are meeting in the school. They are also working in the fields in the morning. So they are hiding and escaping the landlords on certain days to come and get education. But what are the implications for larger society in these efforts? Located within a long history of oppression, these spaces, small and out of the public gaze, helped to mobilize outcasts for widespread protest campaigns in the future. These led to a process whereby the most oppressed made all attempts to become self-taught individuals, similar to the experiences of freed black slaves in the plantations south of United States. On Sundays, the slave schools were most active, and missions reported the enthusiasm and the decorum with which the Pulayas gathered for prayer. Verki Moopan, one of the elderly people who started teaching these schools at Kottayam, he said that my school consists of runaway slaves and children. So please note the word runaway. They were actually escaping the landlords. I started with 4 children and now I have 30. And about 8 in the morning, they bring their roasted roots, rice boiled and tied up in leaves, and they attend the school. They are divided into 2 classes. Some are taught by individual communicants and the other by the girls of the girls' school. The commonsensical view that British missionaries were hugely responsible for these development begs revision. So this is my critique of Taragan and others. While the CMS and LMS sowed the seeds of a schooled literacy, they definitely propagated school-based literacy. The actual organization of slave schools was prompted by community efforts. So when it came to the actual participation of schools, you will see that it is a very slightly different history. The subaltern classes are also participating in the shaping of their future. For instance, Nathaniel Chamigaram, a native catechist of Chatramangalam, noted the hostility in the region. I have often been threatened by the rich Nayars for preaching the gospel to the slaves. I have to leave the main road. I have to take a circular route to the house of a Christian because the Nayars are waiting to beat me. The Christians here are very humble and obedient, and I attentively hear all that I can read or preach to them. Such efforts exasperated the landlords, who did not leave any stone unturned to stop these schools. So at Pallam, Elizabeth, a young girl convert in 1862, she was threatened with beatings for her refusal to renounce Christianity. Unfortunately, she was chained to a tree one night, tortured extremely until somebody released her. And as soon as she released, she ran away to the mountains and joined the growing congregation of runaway slaves. Similarly, in Tiruvalla, missionary Hawksworth encountered a Syrian Christian landlord who started a school of his own, and then he forced the children of his slaves to attend the school. When one of the boys resisted, he, and I quote, not only was beaten, but a bramble put around his waist and pulled back and forth until the flesh was all torn. In his conversation with the grief-stricken father, Hawksworth reported that the man did not want to leave the site of the burned down school. Instead, he affirmed that his faith would lead for the school to become a church. So, of course, Hawksworth is adding a bit of drama in this conversation. He's saying that the father took an oath that there will be a church in the same place where my son was killed. And Hawksworth is trying to tell the British supporters that this is the determination with which the lower caste converts are living in Travancore. In these interior slave schools, there was no strict age stratified bifurcation, and children studied alongside adults. And this is something important to note, because in our modern idea of schooling, and we have all been to schools, you are divided according to your age. So class 1 is for 6-year-old. If you're in class 10, you're 15 or 16 years old. And there is what is called age appropriate learning. And this is one of the features of modernity, of modern life, that each child is socialized into particular age-related roles. But in the slave schools, there is no possibility of that, because there is no capital, there is no land, there are no resources. Whatever people can gather, they're putting it together. And you see in the slave schools, there is no divide between the child and the adult. They're all studying together, because they're not studying for an examination like in the Travancore, other schools in Travancore. Here, they're doing very, very basic literacy classes. And the idea is you will be able to read the Bible. And Sanal Mohan's work has excellently shown that what does that mean? Even the ability to read the Bible will open up a world of new religious and emotional articulation. While the slave schools occupied significant attention, another set of schools actively established. So in my concluding section, I'm just going to briefly talk about another set of schools. So on one hand, you have the slave schools and the tensions of the slave schools. And on the other hand, you have the boarding schools, which was considered to be model institutions by the missionaries. So you have the LMS boarding school, the CMS boarding school, Today, the CMS College, which we are all very proud of, was once upon a time the CMS Seminary. It had a very prestigious boarding school. But the boarding schools pose a very different history to the slave schools. Different kinds of boarding schools existed in colonial India. One targeted the children of princely and aristocratic families. So we know that children of princely states, the rulers were taken away by the British and put into boarding schools. But these are very, very elite boarding schools like the Scindia School, the Mayo College in Ajmer. Later you have the Doon School and all of that. But the other kind of boarding school targeted poor and destitute children, victims of famine and epidemics, sick and destitute. And these children were kept in these spaces in the name of child welfare. And I highly recommend the work of Satadru Sen, a very famous scholar of historian of childhood in India, who has studied these kind of schools in detail. So you have two kinds of boarding schools. One is the elite boarding school and one is the ordinary boarding school for the poor child. The aim was to convert the marginal child, the poor child, visible in the outside domain of work, into a pupil trained towards a single school-based literacy. So what is happening is what is the idea of the school? The idea of the school is that it should allow children to nurture their childhood. It must be a protected site away from the world of adults. But there is also the tension of child labor in Kerala at that time. And what is happening is the missionaries want to take children outside of the field, take them away from child labor and put them into school where they are now going to be school students. They're going to be pupils. And we know from our own experiences, once again, that the site of the school is temporally and spatially very, very controlled. So if you follow Foucauldian discourses, the school is a place of surveillance. You don't simply go to the school and you cannot run free. You cannot run and jump the way you want. The school will determine at what time you should learn mathematics, at what time you should play, what time you should eat. So it is a regimented form of schooling. And the boarding school is the ultimate example of that kind of regimentation. But who were willing to be taught in these sex-segregated mission boarding schools of 19th century Travancore? It was no coincidence that many pupils in the LMS and CMS boarding schools, ranging from 4 to 17 years of age, were mostly Christian children of mission employees or those dependent on charity during periods of distress. So when the missionaries started these schools, they realized that the upper caste don't want to send the child to the boarding school because they're very scared of conversion. So you end up getting either the children of the Christian workers or poor and orphan children that the state is assigning to you. The earliest LMS schools in South Travancore, in the Tamil-speaking stations of Nagarkoil and Neyur, was largely populated by the Nadar agricultural caste. These boarding schools stood at the apex of a tiered system with many primary and vernacular schools established in the neighboring villages. At a time when Pulayas were bought and sold as slaves, remember this is the same time the Pulayas are fighting slavery, the mission benefited from the generous government grant of paddy fields along with the laborers attached to it to run the Nagarkoil boys boarding school. And this is a contradiction that we are now trying to understand. So for instance, I just told you about the Pulaya schools and the state does not want to support them because the state does not even recognize that schooling is a right. It is a human right for the children. They don't care about the slave schools. It is somewhere in the interior fields, nobody is attending to them. But the state is actively participating in encouraging boarding schools. The Nagarkoil boarding school, which today we call the Scott Christian College in Nagarkoil, was actually patronized by the Travancore government. They were very happy to pay the money. And you will see this is the distinction on different children being treated differently. But they were also happy to train children for their own selfish purpose because in the Nagarkoil school, the LMS was going to teach English. And learning English was a big attraction as a matter of cultural capital for the upper caste. So they also start sending the children to Nagarkoil schools. You know, many of the Diwans were alumni of the Nagarkoil school. And on the other hand, the other practical purposes, it prevented the Nadars from entering into government schools. So the segregation is there from the beginning. The government is very happy to have segregated schooling. Such boarding schools were perceived as important places of training a class of native Christian workers, and even in the absence of direct conversion, boarding school children were imparted with the moral responsibility of improving the spiritual condition of their communities. These groups of children were expected to become, quote unquote, little missionaries. And missionaries forged arranged marriages between the school graduates in the hope of raising a community of model Christians. they insisted that children should remain in the boarding school until the age of 16, because that was a good amount of time to, re-socialize them, especially, and remove the practices that the missionaries did not like. So for instance, the missionaries were very unhappy with pan chewing, what in North India you call pan, beetle chewing. They wanted the girls to stop, boring their ears. They found many of the customs terrible. And they also did not want the children to marry early. One of the biggest threats to female education was child marriage. So they are telling the children and the parents that you must remain in the school as long as possible. And the other attempt is, while they are in the school, the missionary is hoping that they will convert or they will become Christianized. So this is an argument that I share with many scholars such as Janaki Nair, even Jay Devika, that even if you don't become Christian as part of a new religion, you become Christianized in your moral outlook. So many of you here must have gone to Christian schools. I think you may have attended convents or maybe private Christian schools. Even if you are not Christian, you have Christian notions of morality. So for instance, you will believe in hell and heaven. You will believe in some of the tenets of the Bible. You will have a certain work ethic. And this is, I would say, this is a success of missionary schooling, that even without making you Christians, they are Christianizing you in your outlook about life, about discipline and habits. And this is what they are interested in. So in conclusion, let me just wrap up the last section. By representing local Malayali and Tamil parents and their practices as violent and negligent, European missionaries sought to intervene in the upbringing of colonized children through a regime in which they to become quasi-parents. So this is an argument of Karen Valgada. She works on Tamil Nadu, where she says the missionaries are trying to displace the parents, not completely, but saying that we are like your parents. We are like your mother and father in the boarding school. And what does this mean? In India, we know that parents have the right to discipline. Your parent can hit you, your parents can beat you if you are considered to be, stubborn or, rebellious. And the missionaries are saying this. They are saying the children should now look at us as their mothers and fathers, because automatically it means it allows them the power to discipline and punish them. In the boarding schools, missionaries admitted usually orphans, or they attempted to keep the parents of poor Dalit children or Nadar children away from their natal settings to minimize the risk of being corrupted. Secondly, and this is a paradox, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, the children of the missionaries, the real children of these British missionaries, they did not live in India after the age of 7 or 8. So as soon as the children turned 7 or 8, the missionaries would pack them off in ships and send them back to England, because the concern was our child will become corrupt in India physically and morally, or India's tropical landscape will kill them because of cholera, malaria. But at the same time, they wanted to take poor children away from their parents. So their own children are back in England, but the child of the poor parent must be given to them in the boarding school. So this is a paradox that they're also facing. The location of the mission boarding school away from the main caste settlements in Travancore was considered ideal to set in motion the inculcation of repetitive rhythms. The myth of the lazy native, it's a myth that we all have been subject to, dominated European missionary discourses of progress, and poor children in Travancore were perceived as in need of a disciplining that taught them to shed their lethargy. So you will see that in these boarding schools, there were strict timetables. You had to get up at 7 o'clock. If you've been to a boarding school, you know this better than me. You get up at 7 o'clock, you eat at 8 o'clock, you go to class at 9 o'clock, you pray at 10 o'clock. So there are very, very strict regimentations and control of your time and space. And this serves a kind of civilizing function for the boarding school supervisors, because they are trying to now implement a pedagogy in which they could convert the native into a productive laborer. And my argument here, and this is my final argument, is that yes, on one hand, there is this temporal spatial reconfiguration, but what about the labor of the child? What are the children doing in the missionary schools? They're of course being taught different subjects. They're learning Malayalam and Tamil. They're learning geography and history. But at the same time, their caste status is still very crucial in the missionary schools. Because what is happening in the missionary schools is that children, the boarding school children, have to do the labor of the school. They have to participate in washing, in cooking, in cleaning, in paddy husking, in taking care of younger children. So you're looking at the space of the school, which is supposed to be a very protected site, But for the lower caste child, there is no escape from labor. So they are going from, it is better than bonded labor. They are not subject to slavery, but they are still being cast as laboring children. Whereas upper caste children don't have to do this. Firstly, they are not going to many boarding schools. And two, the missionary is not expecting the upper caste child to do any of this. But the lower caste child has no option in the boarding school but to participate in these tasks. So they will, in the morning, they will go to school, they will learn the subjects, and in the afternoon, they have to participate in running the organization, running the school. And my argument is that this intersection between caste, poverty, and labor is something very crucial for the history of childhood itself. Because how do you frame these childhoods? Does the poor childhood or the poor child of Kerala actually escape the labor regime? The labor hierarchy remains the same for them. While they are being educated, and that is why the education of the lower caste in Kerala will contribute to many, many social reform associations and movements, while they will be active participants in fighting for their rights. At the time in the 1850s, in the school, it is their caste that will determine how their childhoods are framed. And you will see, I'm not going into detail, but you will see many, many reports from missionaries where children are saying that they don't want to do labor. They don't want to do cooking. They want to play, they want to be like upper caste children, but the missionaries are saying this is good for you. Because when you leave the school, you must become subordinate workers. It is, of course, an unintended consequence that many of them go on to become better than manual laborers. But the mission school is very clear that you don't have to aspire to become like the rich. You only have to aspire to become better Christians or better professional workers. But of course, the poor communities are resisting this. And we know from the history of the Nadar community, of resisting this, the breast cloth controversy. If you look at Kuiman's work, Dick Kuiman has already spoken about how Nadar Christians were traveling to Sri Lanka. They were managing coffee plantations. So they are doing more than what is actually expected of them by the missionary itself. Now, let me introduction and then I'll conclude. One historical, so what does the history of childhood entail? The brief reference to the agency debate I made previously in the beginning of my talk is a matter of great concern to all historians of childhood and youth. If all histories hitherto are about adults, written by adults, about adult matters, then where does the child fit in? How do you write about the lives of childhood and children? One historiographical strand has taken all attempts to bring back the child into the history by discovering their inherent agency. This means the historian will always consider the subaltern child as a resistant figure, as a figure that refuses the imposition of adult norms. But this is, I would say, this is a dangerous slope, and this is what Mary Jo Maines has called an agency trap. You will be trapped if you're only looking for either victims or heroes. If you write your histories only about victims and heroes, then everyday history and the fact that ordinary people make history will be completely forgotten. Mary Jo Maines warns us from highlighting child actors as either victims or only heroes. Her argument is powerful and provocative because it helps us to grasp the everydayness of childhood formation and the role of children in our society and in our rich historical traditions. Are children historical actors? Do children have to speak in order for us to consider them as valid agentic beings? And this is a question that I very often face. Students often ask me, when you go to the archives, do you find voices of children? And unfortunately, I don't. I wish I did, but at least in South Asian archives, you barely see any material left by children. So it becomes a challenge of reading alongside the grain or against the grain. And you have to read into the text to see what did the adults think of children or what may have happened in their interactions with children. How do we understand the lives of children long gone and buried in the past, over whom competing adults fought for the control of their minds and bodies? And this is something in Kerala society as well, where every community is fighting to control the mind and body of the child. So there are different ideologies, there are different social service programs, the media participates. You have the health department participating on having motherhood campaigns and baby campaigns. You have political leaders constantly talking about children are the future of this country, children are the future of the society. So basically, childhood itself becomes a site of ideological contestation. In conclusion, I consider children as socially and institutionally situated and embodied characters. And what interests me most is not children's voices per se, but the material and discursive sides of childhood itself. I say this because there is no singular unified child in Kerala society, just like there is no single Indian child. Structured along the lines of caste, class, gender, and ethnicity, children in India are both representatives and shapers of their particular regional or local imaginaries, sometimes with liberatory potential and sometimes not. However, most importantly, what brings these multiple groups together is the category of age. So I'll stop my presentation there. Thank you so much for patiently bearing with me. Dr. Shiba?
Thank you, Dr. Divya. Gopika, can we get
Thank you so much, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insightful lecture. Now the session is open for queries. Shall I read out the question for you, ma'am?
Yes,
The
please.
first question we have. Okay, ma'am. The first question we have from Sadhana Feroz. Other than Sharada Balagopalan, who else is an authority in childhood studies in India?
Okay, so this is a great question. Thanks so much. Childhood studies is a relatively new field in India, and of course, as you know, Sharada Balagopalan is also the director of childhood studies at Rutgers University. But there are a lot of other scholars from the respective fields. So for history, there is a very famous scholar. Unfortunately, he is no more. It's Satadru Sen. There is Karen Valgada. There is Ishita Pandey, and I would highly recommend that you read the American Historical Review. Has a recent piece on this, on chronological age. So you will see some of these historians speaking there. It is still a very new field, history of childhood, but the other big names are Satadru Sen, Valgada, and Ishita Pandey.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question from Jayanti Changi. Is there any planned strategy played against the abolition of slavery? The slaves become the plantation workers. How far it is correct?
So is there a strategy against abolition of slavery? Definitely. So there are two things. One, in the British Empire is already having discussions of abolishing slavery throughout the empire, not just in Travancore. So there is already a great history that has been written on what are the British trying to do, the abolitionist forces are trying to do. But in India, if you remember, the princely state is only under the indirect control of the British. There is some autonomy to the princely Travancore state, and they only have a British resident. And the British are very careful of interfering in the matters of these princely states. And a lot of missionaries actually write petitions to Madras presidency saying, abolish slavery, look at how terrible they are. Finally, the British will say, do it. And the upper castes are resisting it. Even the Travancore government is resisting it. So if you read the work of T.N. Yeshudas and others, even Sanal Mohan, Sharada Mani, this 1853 proclamation is a very, I would say, a very lazy proclamation. They are saying the future children born of the slaves will be free. That is, unborn children in the future, we will set them free. We will give them freedom. So the question about existing children and adults are not discussed. And two, they're only saying slaves on the government land, not about privately owned on slaves, right? So that itself is an indication. They are not at all interested in abolishing it. It is only much later with the pressure of the British, and the princely government is a little scared that they will lose their power, that they are finally doing it. So there is definitely a strategy. The upper castes are, of course, resisting it. So it works both ways. There is, and the question about do they become plantation workers? You're absolutely right. And plantation work is dependent on contract labor. It is dependent on wage work. So from becoming slave laborers, they will now enter into a field of, world of contract. So when they are released from the land, some of them don't know what to do because they have no capital. They continue to work for the same landlord, but as a wage laborer. And at the same time, the government is opening up PWD works. They're opening up coffee plantations, tea plantations. Many of them will become wage laborers in these plantations. So you are right. Many of them who are freed slaves are going into plantation labor.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from Bhavya, research scholar, SSUS Gallery. First question. Schools were started by Basil Mission in Malabar, while the LMS missionaries started Bazaar schools in Nagarkoil. How did these schools and their teaching learning practices attempt to transform perspectives on childhood?
Okay, thanks so much. So the Basel Mission also starts, you're absolutely right, the Basel Mission also has similar strategies. They have primary schools, vernacular schools, and they also have boarding schools. And they also have, they don't call it bazaar schools, they call it parochial schools for their Christians. And I would say you can find many similarities, except that the Basel missionaries had very few Christians, and compared to the LMS and CMS, they had only in thousands. And the difference that I find in the Basel Mission is the Basel Mission is a far more stricter missionary society. They are far more interested in, punishment, for instance, changing the child individually. So if you read the work of Parinita Shetty, Mrinalini Sebastian, you will see that the Basel Mission is heavily focused on the boarding school child because they don't have many other Christians in the congregation. Whereas the LMS has a huge networks of child. How do they change perceptions of childhood? One, they start arguing that childhood is a scientific phase. They start, talking about the fact that children need a protected site. They are very, very interested in considering the school as a major site of childhood. That anybody who does not send the child to school is failing these children. They are shaping childhood by also, trying to transform these children as objects of piety. They want children, like I said in my paper, they want children to become little missionaries. They want children to go back to their illiterate families and try to change them or moralize them or discipline them. Childhood norms are also changed because they will now start saying that there are appropriate practices and behaviors for children of different groups. So they will say, according to age and gender, you should have appropriate practices. So for instance, girls in the boarding schools and the mission schools are taught stitching, sewing. Like you know about the Nagarkoil girls, they were doing lace work. Whereas the boys will be asked to do gardening or rice cultivation or something else. So there is, I didn't explain it in the paper, but there is a lot of gendered distinctions of schooling as well. So both gender and in terms of labor, they are shaping childhood.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from Marietta Nasrat. Could you provide some instances of the term childhood signifying different experiences in the different historical context of Keralam's past?
Sorry, which is this question? From whom?
Marietta Nasrat.
Yeah. So, I got it. Could you provide some instances of the term childhood? Okay. Now, thank you so much for this question, Marietta, because this is a challenge that I'm facing. And I think it is because I'm a modern historian. I'm only, unfortunately, limited to my sources to the 19th century. But I am assuming that if you look at, I personally don't have the expertise, but definitely childhood refers to different experiences. And it is my claim that this experience that you're talking about is dependent on your caste. So if you are a Pulayar child in the 18th century, 19th century, then the chances are your experiences are very different from being a Nambudiri child or a Nayar child. While age is something that unifies them, while they are all children because of their age, their experiences are certainly different. If you look at the work of Ishita Pandey, she also says practices such as child marriage is very indicative of different experiences in Kerala's past. So you have rituals of child practice, you had children becoming mothers. Today, of course, it is a crime, it is against law, but you will have 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds becoming mothers. So I unfortunately haven't traced it, but it would be something that I would encourage you to do. But that would require you going into medieval and ancient texts as well. And also just one point about different experiences of childhood, then you will also have to see different spaces of childhood. Schooling is a very, very modern concept. So you will have to trace which are the other sites where children are living and functioning. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Another question is also from Marietta. Did the practices of parenting and child rearing change in colonial Kerala as a result of contemporary missionary activities and social reform movements? For instance, do changes in Marimakatayam provide such data?
So absolutely, like I told you about Thomas Norton in the beginning, they are definitely targeting native parenting because this is a civilizational critique. They are making a civilizational attack on, Indian colonized Indian population, saying that you're incapable of parenting itself, and hence you're producing unhealthy children, backward children, and hence your civilization is backward, savage, all of that. Of course, it changes practices of parenting. For instance, the idea of child care as a scientific management is something that is very popular in the 19th century. So, for instance, mothers are or young girls in schools are today we call it home science, but once upon a time it was called domestic management. So, even at a young age in the schools, the girls are taught about the value of nutrition, the value of medicine. That if your child is unwell, what to do. Missionaries are publishing many what is called child life manuals. You will find these small booklets that is advising mothers how to become good mothers and good caretakers, which is again interesting because it comes back to the question of gender. Most of these advice literature is targeted at mothers, which in Kerala, Vanitha Vaichalam, you know this. If you read Vanitha, Grihalakshmi, all the advice most of the time is to mothers. കുട്ടികളുടെ ഭക്ഷണം എങ്ങനെ കൂട്ടാം, എങ്ങനെ കുറയ്ക്കാം, how to improve your skin, how to feed your child, പനി വന്ന what to give your child. All of that is also being told by the missionaries. In fact, they are the earliest ones to say this in the 19th century because child care is seen as a scientific enterprise. It is something that you must scientifically pick up. You must understand that in the modernity of the childhood formation, that child rearing is a modern scientific practice. So, for instance, you must give children this food at this age. You must not let them play outside. Children must be put separately. They must not be kept in the same room as the parents. All of that is actively being taught, and you will see media discourses, advice literature, all of that is doing. J. Devika has also written a bit about this in her work on family planning. Do changes in Marimakkathayam? So Marimakkathayam is critiqued by the missionaries, by Marimakkathayam. The Victorian idea of family is very different. They are not able to understand what is Marimakkathayam. They think this is a very backward practice. They think this is a very promiscuous practice. And yes, all that what I told you about advice literature, it's true. There is some changes, but I don't have the exact data. Also because these are social transformations. So for instance, in Kerala, they are the first ones to start, LMS especially, is the first one to start a mother and child hospital. So they start hospitals and baby clinics. They will start celebrating mothers meetings, baby meetings, where mothers are taught how to be mothers. So all of that is happening.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from Niranjana. It is important to facilitate the access of unprivileged children to sites of modernity. But recognizing the difference in the epistemic premise of a tribal, within bracket marginal, child and child from mainstream society, can their enrollment into modern schools be seen as a step towards their development? Bringing in a subjective lens to measure a child's skill, shouldn't the stress be on evolving spaces of learning that are not merely enforcing a top-down model of study as in your modern schools?
I absolutely agree with you, Niranjana. I mean, your question is also a very contemporary question. And this is something that I also looked at in my own PhD thesis is very often in Kerala as well as in India. So I live in Noida, and every time I tell people I'm from Kerala, the first thing that North Indians will say, oh, in your state, everybody is so educated. Of course, what they mean is everybody is so literate. So we should not also collapse literacy with education, because even people who are not literate might be far more morally and socially aware and progressive than people who are so-called educated. So I completely agree with you on this question of pedagogy itself. And that should question us about what is the role of the school in modern society. Why do we have schools? Are we having schools that reproduce social differences? And we know, unfortunately, schools in India continue to reproduce social inequality. So depending on which school you went to, whether you went to an English medium school or not, all of that is going to affect your future and your aspirations. And unfortunately, the people who lose out on this are extremely oppressed groups, particularly Dalits and tribals. Of course, in Kerala, the numbers are better. If you compare it to Jharkhand or Bihar, we have better numbers. But I agree with you that does it really translate into a modern society? And remember, modernity is not a linear march. So I don't want you to confuse modernity as a teleological approach that today we are backward and tomorrow we will become modern. No, absolutely not. You can be modern and traditional at the same time, and there will be tensions. So for instance, something like arranged marriage. You might be a very, very modern person otherwise, but you will agree to a caste-based arranged marriage. So what we are looking at is education reproduces those contradictions and tensions. And I completely agree that the idea should be to measure the child's skill and aptitude. And there should be a freedom for the child to decide what they want to do. But because schools are a representation of social hierarchies, unfortunately in our society today, there is no scope for that kind of pedagogy, or there is no demand. Everybody wants white collar jobs, and I completely understand why everybody wants white collar job, right? On one hand, we romanticize manual labor. Nowadays, people, romanticize it. Oh, it is great to be a farmer. It is nice to do organic farming. But you have to see the reality. There is no respect for the farmer. There is so much oppression. There is so much discrimination. That is why children of farmers don't want to be farmers. But upper caste will say, oh, these farmers' children, they're so arrogant. They think too much of themselves. And this is the tension that the schools are not able to resolve. So on one hand, if you destigmatize manual labor, perhaps one can choose their different skills. But on the other hand, there must be a collective discourse on what is the role of the school in society. That is something that's important to discuss. So thanks for your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from Anish R. What were the pre-colonial or indigenous notions of childhood in Kerala that the missionaries were engaging with?
Yeah.
The second question.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Can I read it?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Okay. The presentation used aggressive slavery and bonded laborers. Are they interchangeably in the historical conditions discussed here? Another question is also from him. Can I read it out?
Yeah, please.
Missionaries were heterogeneous in their orientation towards the society. Some of them empathetic to slaves, and some were in favor of the slave masters. This aspect needs to be considered. I feel so.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And actually, that's what I did in the paper, right? I'm saying there are different groups of missionaries. Like, for instance, if you look at Rupa Vishwanath's work in Tamil Nadu, they're very active in fighting slavery. They're taking up the cause of the pariahs. Even in Kerala, the LMS, CMS, Basel Mission, they genuinely want the slaves to be liberated. There is a genuine intention. And they have their own colleagues in the same society who don't want to do it. But what I'm trying to do is people are not black and white, right? And the missionary is also not a black and white figure. The missionaries are very complex. When they are empathetic to the slaves, they are facing a different kind of reaction from the upper caste. And they are also compromising and adapting to these circumstances. So for instance, Henry Andrews, Samuel Meteer, they are today remembered very fondly for being champion of outcast causes. And I completely support that. But when you look at their own writings, they are very, very conflicted about race and caste. And the reason is, on one hand, Indians, because of the racial difference, they think very poorly. So they have a lot of racial views about the Indian. They are lazy, they are backward, all of that. And then they have to also face the reality of caste. So that is why it is called double disadvantage. One, you're disadvantaged because you're racially different. The imperial people are looking at you differently. And then because of caste, when the missionaries come, they realize their Christians from lower caste are not treated the same way as upper caste. So in the CMS, Sanal Mohan has shown that Syrian Christians don't want to sit with Dalit Christians. Even today, unfortunately, it is not very easy for Christians from different castes to marry. And I feel terrible saying this, but the tragedy of Indian Christianity is that caste is also part of Christianity. It is also part of many other religions. So conversion has not guaranteed a freedom from caste. But I completely agree with you on the second point, and I take it as a criticism. I did use it interchangeably. So you are right. It is not completely interchangeable in the historical conditions because bonded labor also comes about the shift in slavery and there is a change to contract labor. But the reason why I use the word bonded labor is to say that even after they became free, many of them continue to work in the same land. Their children also continue to work in the same land. So you're right. I will keep that in mind about interchangeability. And the first question, what were the pre-colonial? So there's not much written on childhood in pre-colonial times, but there is some work on education. And somebody who has written is Kathleen Gow. And Kathleen Gow, she worked on the Nayars in Malabar. And if you read her work, she talks about how schools were set up, or schools, Eruthapallis and Pallikudams were run to meet very, very functional purposes of society. And who could attend these Pallikudams? Mostly upper caste people, and it was a local affair. You would gather children of your community, you patronize them. The school teacher will be paid either in some wages, often in kind. You will give them food or fruit or cloth or something like that. So some of the notions of childhood, if you glean it from this history of schooling, shows that upper caste children were still privileged as a set of children. Their childhood was formed around certain questions of protection, certain questions of innocence, and the upper caste child was being trained to occupy powerful positions in future. So a Nayar child is being trained from a very young age to take on the position of a powerful Nayar adult in the future. So the system is literally streamlining them. In terms of lower caste, unfortunately, there has not been much work. So I am personally not aware of what are the notions of childhood for non-upper caste children. But if you look at the histories of slavery, maybe you will understand what are the notions of childhood. Clearly, there are different notions of childhood. And I'm saying this because if you read the work of Philip Ayres is a famous French sociologist. He is the most influential person. He's now critiqued a lot, but he is the one who started arguing that in Europe, childhood is a very modern concept only after the late 18th century. He says until the 18th century, people did not have any emotional attachment to children because of the high mortality. Children were constantly dying. But many scholars have critiqued that by saying, no, that is not true. Parents did have an emotional attachment to children. So if you perhaps examine it through that lens, you should be able to get an answer. But I don't have the data for pre-colonial so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Next from Marietta Nasret. With a new generation of children getting into modern schooling, how did it affect intergenerational relationships, especially in the case of oppressed caste?
Okay, thanks, Marietta. This is a very, very interesting question that you asked. So generation is also an interesting category to look at. There is, of course, tension in the mission schooling. Like I told you, the LMS, CMS, and Basel mission, they want the lower caste to get educated, but not too educated. You know, it's a metaphorical thing. They don't want them to forget their roots. There is tension. So, for instance, in Malabar, the Basel mission started saying that we will not teach English to our poorer children, to the primary school children. English will only be there in the high school and in the college. And poor parents are writing petitions saying, why? Why are you discriminating us? Why can't you teach us English? So there is a generational change where students, or let's say children who are graduating from these schools, are saying, you are not allowing us the same freedom of opportunity like other children. In the Basel mission, there is a lot of concern because after finishing school, the young people are going to the city. So they're going from the villages of Talasheri and other places, they're going to Calicut or they're going to Bombay. Some of them are going to Trivandrum. And the missionaries are saying, okay, this is too much. Don't leave your village. Stay in the village, become important village people because urbanization and industrialization will corrupt you. But younger generation are saying, no, the church is a suffocating institution. You are controlling us too much in the church. And we want the freedom. We want to enjoy the pleasures of urbanization. We want to have the freedom to work in any sector we want, or to at least enter into wage labor. We don't want to do agriculture. So in Malabar, there is a tension. And then, of course, the positive part of it is that it is this generation and many other generations of children who got educated in these schools. They are the ones who are going to lead social reform associations. So especially for the Nadars, many protest movements are led by educated people. Many of them, of course, in Travancore, they also joined the SNDP. If you remember, Ayyankali is inspired by missionary tactics. They are all observing the missionaries. Sri Narayana Guru is learning from the missionaries how to bring together schools, how to set up your own schools. So Hindu reform associations, Dalit reform associations, social lower caste associations, they are all learning from the missionary. how to collect money, how to start your own schools, and how to convince societies that education is the first thing that you should have to modernize yourself. So they are going into different fields. And we also know that when the missionaries left India in 1947, most of them had to leave India. These schools are sometimes very famous as colleges. They are becoming some of India's best educational institutions. So the Women's Christian College, the Madras Christian College, the Brennan College in Kannur, of course, it was given to the Baz Mission, but in charge of the Brennan College in Kannur or the Scott College in Nagarkoil. So there is a post-colonial link as well.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from Anish R. The racist understanding of matter may be explained. The periods of missionaries are also seen important. Norton in early 19th century, Hawkesworth in the mid-19th century, or Mattier of late 19th century. The present-day CMS College was not a seminary. That was another seminary called Old Seminary at Chungam, Kottayam. There was a CNI institution near CMS College, which was an industrial training center and boarding school, and was different from CMS College.
Okay, thanks Anish, thanks for correcting me. It is the Cambridge Nicholson Institution, right? CNI institution, which is near CMS College, which becomes an industrial training center. And many of the students from the CMS College are coming from the old seminary. So thanks for that. Periods of missionaries are important. Yes, I did say that. If you had followed the presentation from the beginning, Norton is in early 19th century, Hawkesworth in the mid-century, and Mattier he's of course throughout the 50s and the 1890s. So yes, there is a chronology in the paper. I am tracing it from the early 19th century till the late 19th century. Racist understanding. So I am not calling Mattier racist in the sense that he's anti-people or anti-lower caste. He's not anti-lower caste because he's racist. What I'm trying to say is that he has racialized views. He has racist opinions about colonized people in general, right? And many of them are believing that lower caste people are lower caste because of their so-called backward intellect and ability. So there is what I call a combination of racial prejudice and caste prejudice. So on one hand, Mattier is saying, okay, open schools for them, start schools for them, include them in the government schools. But he is not really saying anything about what is happening in the LMS churches, where Pulia Christians are being treated very differently from other Christians. And this is, you know this from the CMS history as well. It is the Syrian Christians who are dominating the colleges and the CNI. Pulia Christians are really struggling to be, admitted into the institutions. So the racist understanding of Mattier comes in his notions of the poor. And if you look at studies on Victorian racial formation, racial thinking, the poor is also considered to be degenerate. So the Irish working classes, street children in England, they are also clubbed together as backward people. And in India, people who are backward is anybody who's not a Christian. So these views, these complicated views are mixing with caste views, which are also considering poor people and lower caste people as backward people. So my argument is there is a slippage. There is a very fine slippage. On one hand, Mattier is pro lower caste, but in the functioning of the churches, he is not very critical of the practices of the church.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from Jayanti Chami. Is the land reforms mainly land to the tillers, treated new class, agricultural laborers as new slave class?
So I do think this is a contemporary question to answer. So this is not directly related to the research. I'm not so sure, Jayanti, what you mean by new slave class, because slavery, and I would really caution students from using the word slave loosely, because slavery emerges in a very, very specific historical context. It is a product of a particular historical social formation. So when you say slave class, then you will also have to justify and say what is the nature of this slavery. But when you say land reforms created a slave class, I don't think it created a slave class, but definitely it created disprivileged classes. There were many landless laborers who did not get a good deal from the land reforms, who continue to be treated badly in the hierarchy. But I would be careful of calling them slave class. It is a very, very specific historical context. Today we see it during COVID, right? Many people in Europe are saying we don't want to wear the mask because this is slavery. And the problem with saying that is it is ahistorical. That is not slavery. It is a very different historical formation. So I personally wouldn't say it's a new slave class, but definitely we know that the land reforms have been unequal, and the distribution of resources has had long-term impact. So that's something I agree with you, but no, I don't agree with the use of the term slave class.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from Donald Verghese. Other than schools run by the government of Travancore and missionaries, social reformers like Ayyangali had also established schools or Pallikudam as institutions managed by the oppressed people. How do such spaces contribute to our understanding of the child and childhood? Does such an approach help unpack our scholarship, which appears to be exclusively based on government and missionary archives?
Okay, Donald, thank you so much for this question. And I genuinely hope you do this research because this has been a big question for historians of South Asia in particular. Earlier, you know this better than me, everybody was focused on government archives. It was a very top-down approach. We only looked at policies and institutions. In the last 30 years, we have missionary archives, so we have a slightly different narrative about the people. After all, missionaries, they wrote a lot. They wrote hundreds of magazines and journals and diaries. They had to write reports every week. So we have a rich literature, but of course, you are right, they're very biased also. That is why you should be, I should also be careful of the bias. That's something that's challenging. And when you say reformers like Ayyankali, absolutely, he also started schools. The question is, we don't have records, right? I know Professor Sanal Mohan and his team have started doing oral histories in the last many years. He has been collecting narratives of former slaves in and around central Travancore. So perhaps oral history will change it, but oral history cannot help us understand what happened in the 1890s or 1850s. Nobody is alive from that period, and we do not have the records. We have some records of the 20th century. So we have, if you're interested in studying the Iravas, then there is plenty of records. If you look at Kumaranashan's writings, Vivekodayam's journals, if you look at Palpu's writings, there is some more that you can find out from certain groups. The Nadas also have a lot of material. But for Ayyankali and his followers of the Sadhujana Paripalana Sangam, I personally am not aware of how many records are left. But you can do a recent history. If you want to look at post-independent Kerala, then definitely you will find some more literature. And also remember, let me, since this is the last question, let me rephrase your question. When you're saying schools, if you're only focused on schools, then maybe it will be limiting, because we know that Dalit children did not enter into schools in large numbers until the 20th century. It is only from the 1920s and 30s that more and more Dalit children are entering schools. Before that, the numbers were very, very few. And within that number, the number of graduates were also very, very few. So the number of children who actually, especially girls and all who passed class 10, among the Dalits, the numbers are very, very few. They're less than, it's a handful of numbers. So the actual numbers increased only from the 1920s, 30s, 40s onwards. So if you look at only school as a site to study childhood, then maybe you will not be able to find an answer. But maybe if you look at agricultural practices, if you look at religious practices or familial practices, then maybe you will be able to find out more about notions of childhood. The school, like I told you in the beginning, is a very modern institution. So there is only so much it can only tell you the histories of people who went to the school. So I like your question when you say, what about other children? Then the question I'm asking you back is, then we should look beyond schools. What about people and children and adults who did not attend schools, but also had childhoods, who also participated in the historical process of childhood? And for that, we will have to look at other histories. So maybe if you look at histories of slaveries, a lot of children in the Malabar coast were sold into slavery. I know Ananya Chakravarti is writing a book on this, on Goa and Malabar on slavery. Maybe she will have something to say about children. Many children were, used for experiments in vaccination. Perhaps we will know that. But as far as I know, the missionary archive is still very rich because they actually talk to the poor people. Unlike the British officials, many of them never spoke to people. In many villages, nobody saw a British man until 1947, or maybe they never saw a British person. But the missionaries actually lived among the people. So their archives is, I would say, a bit more closer to helping us writing narratives. But I completely agree with you. You'll have to go beyond schools to write a history. Thanks so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from Jeevan Kolangadan. Thank you, ma'am, for that excellent presentation. My question is, when was the child treated an adult in the early colonial period, as child marriage was often the custom?
When was the child treated as an adult? Okay, so I will be very honest, this is not, like, this is something that I don't really reflect on. So I would really direct you to read Ishita Pandey's book. Ishita Pandey has just written a child marriage in Bengal, but you will find plenty of articles. And it's a question that she actually asks about when does the child become an adult in early colonial period. And what is the interesting thing about child marriage is once you are married, according to colonial law, you are no longer a child, then you are a wife or then you are a husband, right? So the transition is literally overnight. Hence, if you follow a chronological period, if you say 6 to 12, you're a child, 12 to 15, you're a teenager, 15 to 20, you're a young adult, then this will collapse. So you're absolutely right in saying child marriage was the norm, and child marriage will not fit into this, because the same 10-year-old girl on Monday is a girl, and on Tuesday morning she is somebody's wife, and hence law is looking at you differently, society is looking at you differently. So the question that I think the framework that Ishita Pandey says is that if you want to understand how children transition into adulthood, then you have to look at the norms of adulthood. What does it mean to be an adult? Are you talking about physiological development? And this is where the role of medicine will come into play. Medicine will say girls will mature faster than boys, and girls will become adults first. It's a very common argument that we make. And Ishita Pandey questions that. Law will also tell you very differently. So today, the age of consent is 18 for girls, but 21 for boys. So I'm asking you the question, why is that at 21 you are an adult and not at 20, not at 19? And Ishita Pandey is answering this question that you asked about how law and medicine is also coming into play in the construction of age as a marker of these different formations. So who is a child, who is a boy, who is a girl, who is a young adult, who is an old adult, is a sex age stratification. And that is why age must be considered a category of analysis. So I am not in a position to talk about it in detail, but Ishita Pandey is definitely answering your question. So I would encourage you to read Ishita Pandey's work.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from Dr. Sumesh. Excellent talk, ma'am. Can you say how do we classify the childhood stage, since we had no clear demarcation in 19th century Kerala about child or youth, etc.?
Thank you, Dr. Sumesh. This is exactly what I just said to Jeevan. Because if you follow a chronological development, then you are right. We cannot clearly demarcate. So how do we classify? My question is, why do we have to classify? Because by classifying, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to say children are dependent characters? Because are they not historical characters of their own? And that is why the question of agency comes to being. So I will encourage you to reflect on agency. That is, can children act autonomously? Can children have a voice of their own? Because the minute we use the word children, we mean they're dependent. They're dependent on some adult for something, for food or clothing or protection. Then the question that we need to ask is, if the child is a dependent character, then why are people fighting over the child? Why is everybody in society morally worried about the child? So that I would say classification is not the way to go. We don't need to classify childhood. What we need to understand is the shift in childhood norms. What we need to understand is how is society viewing children and how are children negotiating these different norms and practices? And are they also influencing the shaping of these practices? And what is the value that we ascribe to children? So I will look at it that way, not in terms of a stage kind of thing. And also I will again bring in the question of age, because it is age that determines social status, right? So we are also looking at this temporary transition from childhood to adult, and it will be interesting for you to examine what does age do to you? why is age so important in determining your social status, along with many other social markers?
Thank you, ma'am. Another question from Sajjana Feroz. Other than schooling and child marriage, no other aspects of childhood had written in India.
Okay, so Sajjana, I didn't understand your question. Other than schooling and child marriage, no other aspects of childhood written by historians in India, do you mean? Or do you mean written by anyone?
Yes, by historians.
Okay, so there is a lot written. For instance, there is on health. A lot of historians have written on health, Esme, Cleal, and others. And the reason why they've written on school, like I told you, because school is seen as a site of childhood, and child marriage because of social reform debates. So Tanika Sarkar, Ishita Pandey, all of them have looked at child marriage. There is of course a lot of sociological work on childhood, plenty of sociological work. Satadru Sen looks at orphanages. He also looks at juvenile reformatories. There is a good friend and colleague of mine in Nottingham University, Arun Kumar. He looks at labor, colonial child labor and children in Bombay Presidency. So there is some work on labor, but generally there is very little work in India. There's very little work in South Asia, but there is plenty in Europe. So if you're looking at European or American literature, they have written on childhood and cinema, childhood and theater, and also sources are also available. They have better archives and better preservation techniques. But in India, mainly it has been schooling, child marriage, health, and some parts of violence against children and things like that. But generally, it's a new field, so there's a lot of scope to be done.
Thank you, ma'am. Hoping that Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
There would be no more questions for the session. Thank you, ma'am, for your answers. And now we are going for the last session. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Usha, research scholar, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, for delivering vote of thanks. Over to you, Usha.
Thank you. It is my privilege to propose vote of thanks on this occasion. On behalf of the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, I extended a big thank you to Dr. Divya Kannan for her excellent talk on child caste education in the history of colonial Kerala. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing such very informative points with us. I also extend my thanks to all the participants, especially those who are engaged with queries and questions. Once again, thank you to all.
Thank you, Dr. Dev.
Yeah, thank you.
That's superb presentation.
Thank you so much.
Listening to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shiva, and thank you to the students for sitting till 8 p.m. patiently. Something that my students